Hi guys, my name is Michael Holt and I am currently studying an exercise and sports science degree at the University of New England. This presentation is basically the wrap up of a subject that we've been completing, and the subject is called 335 Exercise, Motor Control and Human Development. And this was coordinated by Dr. Dominic McNeil. This presentation is based on a lab that we did at intensive schools, and I chose to do it on movement variations. Movement variations is a very important concept to understand and to appreciate, such as us being able to interact and adapt with our environment. We're not just in clear, straight parameters. There is undulations, there are hills, there are obstacles to negotiate. And within the lab, we broke it up into three sections. We had posture, how we stand, and what enables us to be able to keep our centre of balance over our feet. We had gait analysis, which is the mobility, how to get from A to B safely and carefully. And we also had the amazing reaching and grasping, to be able to interact with the world, to manipulate objects. The research has shown with posture is that in a quiet stance, there is actually a little bit of sway that occurs as we're just trying to keep our centre of balance over our feet. And they've actually done studies on how the muscles start to engage during these movements. Originally, it was thought that those quiet movements, swaying movements, was just about the ankles, and that the whole body was pivoted around. Whereas in 2005, Kurth observed that there was a lot more to it than that. The knees had to be involved, the hips had to be involved, the ankles also, so it was a multi-linked pendulum effect that was able to keep the centre of mass. And also there's been some studies on the feed forward and feed back scenarios on how to keep your posture right, such as Platsev, a Russian scientist, he looked at how there was an anticipatory effect in a feed forward scenario, which is anticipating. You've already got a blueprint of what's going to happen, and imagining basically stepping out onto a frozen lake of ice, and you're going to be careful not to crack so that you don't go through into the ice rather than just stomping out. So that's a feed forward scenario, whereas a feed back scenario is basically you're feeling how you're going. You're getting sensory feedback as you're actually doing the approach, such as walking along and then stumbling and then having to correct yourself again. Okay, so that's all to do with the posture. Number two was mobility and gait analysis. And Duss and McCollin, they did a nice breakup of it basically into progression, how you're actually going to get from A to B, how your posture is going to be as you get there, and also adaptation, such as what we talked about just with the posture before, having to negotiate things in order to get there safely. Yes, and the final section, number three, very interesting, reaching and manipulating. And the research has been a bit controversial on when it actually starts in the human body, such as, is it something that's genetically hardwired into us, or is it basically something that we have to experiment with, and then we get the feedback and then we create the pattern in our mind. Piaget did a lot of that in the 1950s, and Grenier, a French scientist with his colleague, did a lot of studies on the genetics and how that we actually are hardwired. And current research shows that there is a genetic blueprint, and by stabilizing basically a baby's head, they're able to reach and grasp things more easily. Alright, so now we're on to the methodology part. Very important as how to test for what we're trying to observe. And what we're trying to observe is subtle variations in movement, which is going to be very important from a clinical and client point of view, such as being able to identify small defects or small variations that maybe will accelerate and help performance. Defects such as being able to help the client to walk better if they're in a clinical situation. Now, what we first observed was to do with posture. And within this framework of posture, we were asked to pair up, and I, a 34-year-old male, paired up with a 29-year-old male. And we looked, just to begin with, at how there was a little bit of natural sway within a quiet stance. A quiet stance being you just standing. And we're just to identify the limits of stability. There was a progression, such as standing to begin with, and then making it gradually harder and harder. Closing your eyes to make it more difficult, and then seeing how much more that would alter. Whilst we're doing that, we're also analysing what muscles were involved and to what degree. After that, number 2 came along, which was mobility. This was a very important part because being able to get from A to B in a safe and efficient manner is critical in our world. We had to have a look at a progression as well, from walking all the way through to running. And in between was walking faster, jogging, and then at the end was the running. We had to identify the differences between our partners and what to look for as far as strike patterns on the ground, what was happening anatomically, and how much force was being applied through the body. Number 3 was the reaching and the grasping, being able to manipulate an object of varying degrees, shapes and sizes. Also, the weight was a big part of what we had to identify and look at, such as, is the body having to brace itself more to pick something up, and what are the fine motor control movements that are involved with dexterity and picking things up. Okay, so now we're moving on to the results. What did we actually find within these tests? So my partner and I, we found that we did indeed have some pressure excursion and that there was a natural sway that was happening. Not very large, but nevertheless it was there. When we went up onto our toes, the body did have to work a little bit harder to be able to stabilise. When we went to our furthest limits, both ways, anterior and posterior, we felt different muscles engaging. For instance, when I leant forward, we both felt that the posterior kinetic chain had to engage a lot more. The calves, the hamstrings, the glutes, spina recti, even up into the neck, it had to hold itself harder. Whereas when we went back, we felt the anterior kinetic chain start to engage, such as the anterior tibialis. It had to get the feet to hook up a little bit more so that you wouldn't stumble. The quads engaged more, and you even felt it through the rectus domino, right through here. Okay, so we did notice that there was different synergies of muscle activation that occurred. And when we went up onto our toes and we did the same thing, the body did have to basically do the same thing but accentuate it in that manner. However, what we did find was when we were in our quiet stance standing and we looked around about 3 feet in front of us, the sway almost stopped completely, which is interesting. So I think there needs to be more research into spotting something close and what that has an effect on. Moving on to the gait analysis now. It was very interesting. My partner and I, we both had different walking patterns. He was quite a bit shorter than I was, and he had quite a strong leg lockout and a heel strike pattern. So it was very much this sort of position. Whereas I had a little bit of a softer knee, whereas I didn't fully extend and I had a lighter sort of impact on the ground. What we noticed as well, that we had similarities as we had to progress our velocity and speed up. When we started to walk faster, our hip rotation had to work much harder. And we had a laugh as well. And once we reached a certain velocity that was too fast for walking, we did start to jog. And then the whole muscle patterns start to change. Even the way the foot impacts on the ground changed as well. Such as instead of a heel strike, when you're walking, there began to be a midfoot to a forefoot strike. Midfoot being here, forefoot there, and it was a lighter, more elastic recoil situation where you're storing the energy and going along. And with a full run, obviously there is more accentuated elements in those muscle patterns. You start to extend out, the hips start to drive through more. Stride length and stride frequency started to increase, and that's basically how you get from A to B more quickly. We just noticed also that there was definitely a longer phase on the stance leg as we're doing our swing phase with the walking. So as you're walking through, as research suggests, we did notice that there was a 60-40 ratio as you were doing the walk, and it actually swaps over when you start running. It starts to become 40-60. Moving on to grasping now, the third part of the lab. We basically had to manipulate a whole lot of objects, and we found that there was a lot of interesting things with the way someone would pick something up. When it was a fine object, the body did seem to have a efficient pattern of picking it up. Such as with a pen, we noticed that there was pronation of the forearm. The fingers would basically extend out and then contract and flexion and then turn it back, and the pattern presented itself over and over. Interestingly, I was the only one that had a feed forward approach with that, whereas I already had a blueprint of what I was doing, that I was aware of how to pick the pen up, whereas my partner and a couple of the other groups that were performing the task, they just basically did a feedback and they just saw what was going on. So there was a little bit of variation within the findings there, such as just the approach. And when we started to pick up larger objects, you couldn't necessarily identify that they were larger and heavier. There was boxes, and there was things within those boxes or not in those boxes. And when you pick up a heavy box to begin with, we noticed that there was a little bit more posture bracing, and we had to pick it up in that fashion. When we thought that it was the same heaviness and it was really light, the body almost became a little bit off balanced, which aligns basically with the muscle recruitment theories that are out there with research at the moment. Okay, so in summary, what we found is basically aligning with the current research, in that the body does make amazing adaptations to its environment and tries to find the easiest pathway to performing that task. From a practical point of view, it is so important, like we mentioned before, to be able to analyse subtle variations, to basically be of service to people, to help them to improve and to help them to overcome difficulties. Thank you so much for watching, and if there's anything else that you'd like me to talk about, please send me a post. We'll see you later. Bye.